Chapter 7 is called Report to Peter, and there's a picture here of Tom, and he's writing his letter. Look, you can see his old-fashioned ink pot and quill pen, and there's Uncle Alan and Aunt Gwen in the background. Okay, so, not unless you put the clock back, Uncle Alan said carelessly in answer to Tom's last question. Tom doodled with his pen in the corner of the letter he was writing to Peter. A clock dial, which he then enclosed at the top of a tall rectangular case. A grandfather clock, in fact. He took some minutes to complete it, then addressed his uncle again. What clock? What did you say, Tom? You said a tree could not be lying fallen at one time and then be standing up again as it was before it fell, unless you put the clock back. What clock? Oh, no particular clock. Tom scribbled out his sketch of the grandfather clock. It's just a saying, Tom, to put the clock back. It means to have the past again, and no one can have that. Time isn't like that. His uncle returned to his reading, and Tom began doodling in another part of the writing paper. After some time, he found that he had drawn the shape of an angel-like creature, with wings from his shoulders and with straddling legs. He had drawn the creature before he was aware, and then was startled at his own handiwork. He could not at once think whence the design had come into his mind. Then he remembered that it belonged to the grandfather clock, and he scribbled that out too. Then, what is time like, Uncle Alan? Asked Tom. His uncle put down his book altogether, and his aunt nervously put down her mending too. Tom, she said, you shouldn't always be asking such very odd questions of your uncle. He's tired after his day's work. Oh, no, Gwen. A child's questions should certainly be answered. All I would object to Tom's questions is their lack of connection, and sometimes of seriousness too. Look at his first question. He asked whether it would be possible to go through a door. He actually asked how it would be possible. Well, cried Tom's aunt, with a relief that came from her not having paid attention to the earlier conversation. Well, that seems a very sensible idea, so sensible that it's almost silly. Alan Kitson raised his eyebrows, and his wife went on hurriedly. You know what I mean. Going through a door's such an everyday happening. Not when the door is shut. Then Tom went on to ask about the invisibility. The invisibility of a person like himself. Sometimes in fairy stories, Aunt Gwen began. Tom shook his head indignantly. And finally, his uncle continued, we have this question about a tree's being able to lie fallen one day, and then on the next day, against all the known laws of nature. It was a dream, interrupted Aunt Gwen. Just a queer dream, wasn't it, Tom? No, it wasn't, cried Tom passionately. It was real. Indeed, said Uncle Alan with slow relish. So this tree has really existed. This extraordinary incident has really happened. Tell us where, Tom, and when. Where and when, Tom? Tom remained silent. He dug his pen in a row of inky holes down the side of his paper. Come, Tom. It was a fairy tale, said Aunt Gwen, returning with desperate playfulness to her first suggestion. Goblin woodcutters laid it low, didn't they, Tom? Uncle Alan smiled and picked up his book again. I am inclined to think you were right after all, Gwen. It fell in a storm, Tom said in a strangled voice. Lightning struck it. He looked at his uncle as if he would willingly have seen him struck in the same manner. His aunt intercepted the look and saw her husband's mouth opening to speak. She rushed into the conversation again, and this time won. And now Tom mustn't speak again until he's finished his letter to Peter, nor be interrupted. So Tom went back to the letter, cramping his writing between the doodlings and stab marks. All I have told you is true, he wrote, about the door and being invisible and the fir tree. It is all very strange, but I don't mind any of it, except perhaps being invisible to everybody. For instance, there are 3 boys that have come into the garden. Their names are Hubert and James and Edgar. Edgar is about my age, but I think I would like James better. There is a girl who tags round after them. She is very young and is called Hattie or something. Without appearing to detach his attention from his book, Uncle Alan spoke. It's useless to write at length to anyone recovering from measles. After measles, the patient has to be particularly careful not to strain his eyes by overuse. If Tom's letter is too long for Peter, then no doubt his mother will read it aloud to him, said Gwen. In alarm, Tom wrote "Private" in the biggest capitals across the top of the letter, folded it intricately, and wrote "Peter, Private" on both sides. He had to undo it again to sign it, having forgotten that in his panic. He then put the letter into an envelope, addressed it, and wrote "Confidential" in the top left-hand corner. He found his uncle's eyes watching him ironically over the top of his book. Tom felt defiant. He then licked the flap of the envelope and pressed it down. Then he drew the outline of his long tomcat across the edge of the stuck-down flap. Like a seal, it guarded against any tampering. Beneath the cat, Tom wrote B-A-R, burn after reading. Uncle Alan brought out his wallet. Here's a stamp for your precious letter. Tom thanked him stiffly. The letter finished, Tom had nothing more to do. He composed himself to wait patiently for bedtime. There was no real use in his going to bed early. He could not go down to the garden anyway until his aunt and uncle were in bed and asleep. His thoughts ran on the garden, as they always did nowadays. He reflected how dangerously near he had been to betraying it just now. Fortunately, his uncle and aunt had only laughed at him. If they had been more attentive and sympathetic, he might have been trapped into telling more. They might have found out his secret. The very next time he visited the garden, they would have insisted upon going with him. Tom went chill at the idea. "Are you feeling quite well, Tom?" asked his aunt. "Yes, thank you, Aunt Gwen." Nevertheless, she fetched the thermometer and made him put it into his mouth. "You were shivering just now, as if you had a chill." Tom shook his head. "I hope it's not the onset of measles for your sake. Tom, it would mean your staying from home several weeks longer, perhaps, instead of only 10 days. She withdrew the thermometer and took it over to the light. "Only 10 days?" repeated Tom. "I know you must be longing to get home," said Aunt Gwen sadly. She would have liked him to have stayed much longer. Uncle Alan was saying nothing. "Only 10 days. Only 10 days more for the garden." "I think perhaps I have a temperature, and it is measles," said Tom. Surely, even with measles, he could still go down every night to the garden during those extra weeks while the disease ran its course. "I can never find the thread of mercury at first," Aunt Gwen was saying. She twisted and twisted the thermometer, then at last she held it still. "No, Tom, you've got no temperature, so you've no measles. That's a relief for you, isn't it? Home soon?" "But—" "Yes, Tom?" He dared not say it. But suddenly he found that he did not want to go home. He wanted above all to stay here where he could visit the garden. His home now seemed a long, long, misty way away. Even Peter was a remote boy with whom he could only correspond by letter, never play. The boys nearer to him now were called Hubert and James and Edgar, James especially. There was a girl too, but she was only a girl. What had her name been? Hattie. What's going to happen next? We'll have to see you next time. Goodbye.